Let's welcome our next speaker today, Assistant Professor Ariane König. Ariane's research focuses on sustainability science and governance at the University of Luxembourg. Her transdisciplinary research and study programme serves to create concepts, spaces, and processes for transformative governance with a focus on how we engage with water and land. She's a member of Luxembourg Observatory of Climate Politics and the European Statistical Advisory Committee. Prior to Luxembourg, she had held positions at University of Oxford and Harvard and did research and training as a biochemist and genetic engineer at the University of Cambridge. So without further ado, over to you, Ariane.
Thank you, Jake. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present this project here on a scenario approach. Whilst the platform this seminar series provides has focused on the soil health gut connection, I think every speaker so far really has highlighted the need for system change and food system change so that we can get these more nutritious foods and be exposed to greater diversity above and below ground. And so in my talk, we will actually step back a couple of steps and also consider some challenges in getting this larger system shift in the food system. So basically, I will also be slightly different in that I first will present my experiential and intellectual journey that led to my work in sustainability science and also on scenario approaches in Luxembourg. This sets the scene for the Nexus Futures project, a project that involved developing national scenarios on how we engage with water and land in Luxembourg. And I will talk a little bit about process design and methods, because really the red thread through this talk is how different people, depending on their own experiences and disciplinary training at university and professions and organizations they joined, see the challenges we face in the 21st century very differently, and they may have very different ideas on the best courses of action. And so this talk is really about how can we develop participatory work approaches, participatory research, collaborations across different actors with different interests, and what roles can scenarios play in this? And so it really follows on nicely on Ruben's talk, who also emphasized collaborations with different actors in the school system, including students and teachers and parents and old school approaches, and to educate parents and pull the communities along that the schools are embedded in. So this was very close to my heart. So how did I get to what I'm doing so now, and why is this relevant for this talk? Basically, as Jake already said, I'm actually trained. I did a bachelor in biochemistry, and for my PhD research, I actually looked at Streptomyces, so a soil bacterium, and how it synthesizes rapamycin. This is a secondary metabolite that in humans acts as immunosuppressant. So already when I left school, I was really fascinated how our knowledge in biology, and in particular on genes and DNA that just came out in the 80s, would change how we relate to nature. I was really fascinated that looking at yeast, there are some genes that have over 30% similarity to human genes, and those are often genes in cell signaling processes. So, boy, there is so much conservation across evolution in some of these pathways that we use well, and that connect us as species. So that was interesting, but the PhD really would have set me onto the track of the pharmaceutical industry. And I thought that was too ethically complex. It's all about treatment and not prevention. And so as I was looking for a good PhD in around 1992, it was the Rio, well, and later was the Rio Earth Summit. So I thought, well, let's look at the population growth, food production, and environmental impact conundrum. And so then I joined briefly the European Commission to look at regulatory affairs of genetically modified crops. How are decisions on the health and safety taken when we deal with crops that have been genetically modified to reduce their environmental impacts? And so as a genetic engineer trained, it was a bit like that in your studies, you get a hammer and then you look at the next nail to hammer in. And as a molecular biologist, it makes complete sense to isolate a protein that allows you to save large-scale applications of persistent environmental toxicants that have impacts on many diverse life forms, and to replace them with singular proteins that have an extremely well-defined function and impact. But then I got also a job offer from a leading life science corporations to work as regulatory affairs manager for genetically modified crops across Europe, Africa. And that was super interesting. And I thought, well, if I see something I don't like, I have some journalist friends and I will talk to them. But at the same time, it's a solution we can't really disregard. But actually then in the period when I joined, and you might have guessed, it was Monsanto, Monsatan. So I was working on the regulation of Frankenstein foods. So, and in my interviews, I had spoken out for labeling, and they did not support that, but they hired me anyhow. But there were a lot of environmentally super engaged colleagues. And I mean, it's not a black and white story the way you read it in the media. But throughout the time I was there, the 4 years, there was a huge controversy growing. The sun never set on the issue in the newspapers. And 2000, there was the legal system broke down in the EU. There was a huge trade war on genetically modified crops, including crops I was responsible for. And although I felt I was doing morally the right thing, people were telling me, you cannot have any morals for what you do. And so I decided to leave, although Monsanto really tried to keep me and made me amazing job offers. And I stepped back and went to the Harvard School, the Kennedy School of Governance, and joined Sheila Jazanov's research group on science and technology studies, looking at the co-production of science, knowledge, social norms, values, and social practices. And how that can happen in different regulatory systems and cultures. And I continued looking at similar questions when I came back to Europe. But then when my daughter arrived, I stepped back a little bit from research and joined the University of Luxembourg in the role of head of sustainability. And I built the study program with everything I wish I had ever known before joining Monsanto as a mere molecular biologist, biochemist. I really spent the last 15 years diving ever more deeply into history and philosophy of science. I got utterly confused by all these science controversies and controversial disputes across scientific fields of molecular biologists were contradicting ecologists, and etc. And again, different professions taking different sides. And me being a perpetual fence sitter, basically, I dived into the philosophy of science. What is a fact, and how do we know? And how do we get to these controversies and polarized situations that hinder our actions, taking actions on these pressing existential issues? And so basically, I haven't stopped reflecting, and all my work is still informed from that intense lived experience I had whilst at Monsanto, being active across over 30 countries in different legislative settings at the interface of the science, the law, public acceptance, and politics. And so I'm really interested in how what we know impacts our intentions, aspirations, perceptions, what experiences we seek, how we form our lifestyles and our actions, and how that can be so different depending on what we learn and what main mental models we have. And I also was very surprised when I went back to university after having been at Monsanto that all these pressing research questions I formed whilst being in this polarized environment, there was already decades of research out there. So there's a real confinement of specific knowledge to particular communities of knowers. And yes, we are dealing with wicked problems when we are thinking of these transitions. So although there has been talk about the need for agroecology and regenerative agriculture in our actual food system, especially in Europe, I feel the switch is really, really slow. Because we're not all pulling on the same string. We're dealing with wicked problems with, if we get down to the devil of the detail, who plants what when, and who pays for what, and how we market this produce, and how we come up for the different labor intensities in terms of practices of care. And it becomes very complex, and how that might impact equity and affordability. I mean, these are systemic challenges, and we will always have incomplete information and uncertainty. Things will play out differently in different contexts and places. Over time, dynamics, social dynamics and interests will change, also with migration. And so I think we can organize ourselves better to address such wicked problems with all these dimensions in our turbulent times. And so at Harvard, I basically got into thinking also in terms of philosophy of science, but also sociology of knowledge, and how the different disciplines actually, how science itself can be part of the problem. So science definitely is part of the solutions, but if we are dealing with highly fragmented knowledge fields where contradictions arise from experts looking at different facets of a problem because they focus on different aspects, such as molecular biology on one hand and ecology on the other. So even within the discipline of biology, it becomes difficult. And so at Oxford, I met, and he was my sparring partner for 20 years, also when building my study program, Jerome Ravetz, who's a philosopher of science and used to be a mathematician, who then critiqued the way we engage with numbers in society. And so Jerry Ravetz developed the concept of post-normal science. How can we improve how we produce new knowledge when facts are uncertain, stakes are high, and values in dispute? And so he was saying, well, I think so, especially when we look at what evidence base informs our policies and decisions, basing them merely on specific experts in particular fields may not be enough, may not prove enough to inform socially robust policies and decisions, including in the agricultural sectors, on how to develop subsidies schemes to help farmers to do the switch. And so everything is quite complex. I also, whilst at Harvard, had the great opportunity to work with Sheila Jasanoff, who wrote a lot about the co-production of technologies and scientific representations and how they actually affect what values we might defend and how we regulate things, and which actions and activities are promoted and which may be excluded or prevented merely through how we structure our knowledge system. And she also developed the heuristic of socio-technical imaginaries. So pointing to the fact that societies often have visions embedded in their policies and legislative systems of what desirable futures are with respect to technologies and infrastructures, but how, on the other hand, technologies and infrastructures can structure social life and social order, and even affect who has a voice and who has not. So there is direct links to politics and power with science and technological decision-making. So just looking now at the issue of global land degradation and degraded soils, I think previous speakers have showed similar slides, and Ruben also has introduced the pressing issue of soil degradation in more detail. So in the field of science and technology studies, the framing of soil degradation from human practices of growing foods that is highly accelerated with the impacts of climate change and increasing occurrence of extreme weather events like droughts or storms, increasing runoff. So in the face of these challenges, there are additional challenges we must take onto our radar in terms of growing inequalities and impacts of switches in pricing and such mechanisms that may enhance further inequalities, but also the increasing polarization between different actor groups, depending on their experiences and their convictions and what they've learned. Should we further look at globalization to enhance systemic efficiencies, or should we ring fence ourselves off locally and promote local values and local sovereignty and local ways of thinking and doing at the cost of interconnection? So there is this visible increasing polarization that we absolutely need to overcome, because in all local communities, there will be a mix of people, and polarizations often hinder action rather than fostering action. So basically, Bruno Latour, for example, said one promising approach is to really transcend these polarizations, is to think about what leads to the earth. So how can we reconceive the places where we live and act? And that was very much resonating with Ruben's presentation also, to lead school education also in the early years back to where we live and multiple species and their needs, and how we can see humans as embedded in a web of life, as opposed to engaging in extractive behaviors, disregarding the needs of other species we actually depend upon. But this needs paradigm shifts, serious paradigm shifts in how our system, the economic system, the market system, the regulatory system functions, and how questions are framed in political discussions and in market behavioral patterns. So we are really dealing with systemic traps. So it's no one's fault. We can't now start finger pointing of who does wrong what. We are all caught up in a large system from which behavioral patterns arise that are difficult to break through. And so, for example, of course, we have now exhausted soils, and regenerating these vast surfaces of commodity crop production areas is difficult and will take time. And this switch is not done easily, and it will not happen fast to get the soil life back. At the same time, farms need to have functioning business models. Also farms and agricultural practices are embedded in infrastructures. And again, science and technology studies, this interdisciplinary field, has a lot of compelling analyses of how even just infrastructures are not only physical things, but they shape relations of the things, the people, the ideas, the materials that circulate within them. And so farming is embedded in very interconnected ways or in the energy system. It depends on fossil fuels, but also in the water system and water infrastructures. So we are really talking about a very complex, closely intertwined and interdependent social ecological system, where we have very diverse opinions on how we can best effect changes, and where top-down regulation is very, very, very slow in effecting changes, in particular in a market system where individual organizations still have to operate according to certain rules on how to finance themselves. So looking at systems theory, in my research, we're really interested to find leverage points, places to intervene in a system to foster system change. And so Donella Meadows, who was at MIT in the systems group, has written a great paper that's worth looking at and very accessible in terms of leverage points. And she's saying the biggest leverage points will be not only changing system structures and the way a system can organize and learn to organize itself, but also to change the system's overarching goals. So basically, in a system where many nations still feel economic growth is necessary to support the welfare system, it will be very difficult to have large-scale impact in large-scale changes in food system practices. And so the paradigm used to design the system is of utmost importance. And so perhaps the highest level leverage point is to equip actors in the system to transcend paradigms, to recognize the paradigms they're embedded in that frame their mental models, and to develop the courage and the emotional certainty in the face of uncertainty to break up the paradigms they have oriented their lives by, and to be ready to reframe. How do we do that? That's a tall order. So that's a little bit, that is the set of questions we are trying to address. So over the last 10 years, we have developed an approach to science we call transformative sustainability science. That is an approach to research that takes account of complexity in systems that span multiple systemic scales and spheres, the personal, the social sphere, the ecological sphere, the technical sphere. We need to be better in science to embrace uncertainties, ignorance, open futures. The social norm to scientists that knowledge should be abstract and of universal validity doesn't always help us. I think in many fields of knowledge, it is of advantage to also make space and room for discussing contingencies in greater detail, different situations over space and time and how things may play out differently, and challenge assumptions of more generalized, universally applicable or not models. And we need to be better at identifying contradictions between different fields of knowledge, between different professions, between different actor groups and interests, and to leverage these contradictions as a creative space. How might we reframe to reconcile the contradictions? And so this is how we developed transformative sustainability science approaches to live up to all these requirements and procedural attributes, not only interdisciplinarity, including social and natural scientists who might contradict themselves, but also transdisciplinarity being embedded in practice, often having practice on top, such as farmers, and science on tap for meaning making. So all this is important, and in particular also local knowledge and knowledge how things play out differently in different circumstances may need to be at eye level with usually high-level authority scientific experts. So we need to engage with humility as researchers. We basically ask, can we reconfigure the science policy practice interface and improve the self-organization of actors and better connect them across governance levels and legitimize more decentralized knowledge co-creation? Because at the moment, there's a huge gap in authority. That doesn't serve us well. And in the EU, there's so much goodwill in policy making and so many subsidies, but so many subsidy schemes fail. The farmers just don't take advantage of them because they don't suit the way they were developed. Doesn't suit the farmers so well in making the changes they need to make if they then are strapped into some monitoring regime that doesn't help them to make their day-to-day choices. And so citizen science, for example, is a big thing we want to promote. And then how can we contribute to a paradigm shift in nature-human relations with a focus on how we engage with land and water? So really we want to contribute to two paradigm shifts in our research. And there's a tension between them. On the one hand, we want to legitimize and create a safe space where different ways of knowing can meet, where we have what we call in philosophy of science, ontological and epistemological pluralism. We want to promote different ways of knowing, different understandings of what matters. But at the same time, we are actually, as researchers, somewhat biased in that we believe an ontology of more than human thinking, of sort of understanding that relations to other species are very important. So that we feel we need to enrich prevailing discourses with that. And so that is a nice tension, but that we need to make explicit. So our roles as scientists is in transformative sustainability science. So scientific inquiry is still a planned, systematic, structured, self-critical process to create new knowledge, but that ends in an iterative learning process from action and reflection in practice. And so it complements. We're not saying we need to replace everything that's happening in science. No, there is so many brilliant research approaches, including everything presented here. We just say, as a complement, it is good if we have this form of science where the researchers engage diverse actor groups, professions, and experts across the governance levels. And we develop concepts, methods, and processes for dialogues across differences where people meet at eye level to really inform mutual learning from what may be more socially robust courses of actions that are meaningful across different perspectives. And how can we create more spaces and time carve out for reflection and evaluation of such actions? So in sum, how can we make living laboratories? And we have developed several projects. One was the School Futures project, where we embedded systems thinking and schoolyard transformation, very much along the lines of what Ruben was describing in 3 schools in the Luxembourg school system, to develop approaches to inform the school curriculum on how we can better connect learning across subjects in practical projects in schools, such as gardening. But what I want to talk about today is the Nexus Futures project. And our assumptions are really, we need regenerative practice. Just reducing harm is no longer sufficient when we engage with water and land. We, in our research team, make explicit that we have a clear multi-species sustainability ethics that spells out clear responsibilities of humans to other species, including and in particular to soil microbes and soil life. And we also believe that dialogue can transform relations. So we see one of our large parts is, yes, we support experimentation, including on farms or along rivers for restoration and regenerative practices, but also workshops are really important where we have 2 logics or more than 2 logics meeting to make meaning across differences on how we can relate to each other and the environment. So, and we should be accommodative of different ways of knowing and different understandings of what matters most. So in the Nexus Futures project, we had for most of the time a team of 5 people with a postdoc and 2 PhD candidates, and someone who was a scenario expert, who was the former chief operating officer of the European Patent Office and developed scenarios on knowledge and patenting there. And the setting in Luxembourg was very useful for our research, because Luxembourg is the fastest growing EU country with a very limited surface area. So over 600,000 people now, with 230,000 cross-border commuters every day, in a country that's 56 kilometers broad and 81 kilometers long. And the environment is, ecological systems are under severe pressure and highly fragmented. And so I will mainly talk about scenarios. So the project involved developing national scenarios on how we engage water and land. It was financed by the Ministry of Environment. It involved developing a citizen science tool to see how we can better collaboratively monitor water quality and impacts of diverse activities. And it involved also a focus on working with river partnerships on better understanding catchment area issues at the local scale and different actors and opportunities. And scenarios, of course, are important for any dialogue on sustainability transformations. They can only be justified with reference to the future. So these are not forecasts or prognoses, mainly quantitative. They are not visions where we want to be, what is most desirable, but scenarios are basically a set of diverse viewpoints on basically futures that are developed with a mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods, with an emphasis on stories. A little bit anything goes, from quantitative modeling to science fiction. Anything the actors feel relevant may be relevant. So these are not scenarios, but scenarios are sets of plausible, challenging, relevant, coherent stories describing different futures that are extremely useful in times of accelerated change, greater complexity, and genuine uncertainty, especially because they help us to distinguish between the contextual environment and global happenings at the macro level that we might not be able to influence so much, but that we might be able to appreciate, and how very different changes and drivers of change in the contextual environment might play out in our transactional environment that we can influence and co-design, provided we collaborate with different actors. And so there is a lot of scenario work now in sustainability science and beyond, of intergovernmental organizations and increasingly corporate actors. But actually, there has been a recent study published in 2023 that there is clear biases in most scenarios, even social ecological scenarios. 72 different scenario initiatives were analyzed, global, international, and national and organizational. And there was a clear bias and lack of reflexivity in terms of how methods were chosen and in terms of how they influenced what windows on the future are opened or not, and what questions can be asked in these exercises. So in the scenarios that span across multiple systemic scales, they were mostly a positivist epistemology. So they focused on Earth system processes, land use changes, population growth, as in the dominant discourse, but they didn't really open up questions on human actions and agencies and the general framing of economic growth. On the other hand, we had a lot of localized scenario processes that were open to different values and visions, but they didn't embrace systemic complexity in the same way. And so what in the Nexus Futures project we ask, and I believe it is one of the really pilot studies in raising these questions, can we develop a differentiated scenario set that enables participants in scenario processes to reflect on and make their assumptions of what matters explicit? And can we discuss different views on human agencies and what courses of action might be most promising across differences? And so we developed a three-phase process of first engaging stakeholders across levels, including EU and international experts and policymakers, as well as national, municipal, and local knowledge holders, such as farmers, in interviews to map contradictions. We engaged then in creating, co-designing in a series of workshops, ontologically differentiated scenarios. And last but not least, we developed these frameworks that we trialed out in place. So where we really, each time we used the scenario scaffolds, we developed a different set of scenarios with the actors who decided themselves what is within scope and what is without of the scope of the scenario narratives that they were using to better understand their differences in opinion and better negotiate across them. And we'll go really quickly because I see time is running. I will try to finish within the next 6-7 minutes, but that's feasible. So we had over 100 different actors. So we conducted well over 60 interviews, and in the workshop still other people joined. We had a steering group of actors across different scales. And we used a range of different methods and processes that I mentioned already. So we engaged in contradiction mapping and found a lack of policy coherence and even contradictions across different policies on water and soil protection and measures to promote biodiversity and carbon sequestration, for example. And there were definitely looking at soil and understanding of soil. On the right, you see that the prevailing viewpoints was really a chemical understanding of soil as a substance that is a substrate for growing plants, and that we can modulate the speed of our extractive practices in growing crops with technologies. The opposite understanding of understanding soil as a living, laboring entity was really underrepresented in Luxembourg, and actually in some circles, especially also amongst some of the policymakers, this is some research in this area was discredited, and so it's difficult to promote this viewpoint, but it's coming. But there was a good change in the narrative identities in some of the professions. So farmers for sure see themselves increasingly as drinking water producers, but then they are saying we need to be paid for this. So also when it will come to soil regeneration activities, there will be need for compensation, and where should that come from? So farmers as producers of living soil, is that the best framing of the story? So all sorts of difficult questions were raised in terms of how deep we need to change our systems and logics to accommodate a society in which regenerative practices evolve into such wide adoption that we have a regenerative culture. So we used a lot of systemic collaborative conceptual systems mapping approaches and engaging artists to highlight controversies through caricatures that we discussed in the breaks. And basically we identified top 10 uncertainties that matter. Oops. And for some reason my oh God. My computer is having issues, but so we ended up with 3 different storylines from all these activities that fairly well aligned with different positions of different actor groups, not perfectly, but we basically had one scenario on smart sustainability, where technological process driven by competition marches forth, but inequalities are neglected, and sustainability in many ways as well, although circular economy and some regenerative practices are adopted, but commodification and all these logics that didn't leave sufficient room for practices of care being taken seriously. On the other hand, we had common good and knowledge rivalries between regions were augmenting in highly localized settings, and centralized infrastructures were failing. But there was more equity and care, and distributional issues were well attended to. And the last story was, so the first one was technocentric, the second sociocentric, anthropocentric, and the third scenario was ecocentric. And similarly, human-environment relations were problematized in each of these worlds differently. So one was the pure Earth system planetary boundaries to inform market and government regulation. In the common good, we had Kate Raworth's donut, putting attention both to ecological boundaries as well as equity boundaries, how we structure social actions, processes, and relations. And in the third one, we basically had the multi-species sustainability understanding. So we had different experts engaging, giving rise to different models of spatial planning based on the three different logics. And all these helped us then in workshops. We used these scenarios in different settings between 20 and 25. For instance, we used them in syndicates of municipalities to discuss climate adaptation plans. These scenarios were very helpful to foster understanding across different takes of the situation and to identify low-hanging fruits of action that were attractive to all of the different actors. And we also had a workshop on agroforestry to explore the potential of agroforestry in Luxembourg across different actor groups to inform policymaking in that area and subsidy schemes, how they might be knit. And we also had a workshop on developing a green belt around the city of Luxembourg, commissioned by the Department of Spatial Planning. And we now also are exploring to develop a knowledge system in support of more decentralized forest regeneration practices. I won't have time to go into details of these workshops, but the first workshop was very short. It was during the pandemic, and so it was fully virtual. And so that is not an ideal setting to get to controversial debates. So, but we ended up identifying low-hanging fruits in municipalities. The second workshop, we actually did the first workshop because the team didn't want to do the scenarios without the scenarios, but two participants were very vocal saying the framing isn't right. If we immediately look into policy considerations, we need another framing for the second workshops. And once we had tabled up the video we made on the three scenario stories and used that, the participants watched that before the workshop, and then we discussed it in the beginning of the workshop as a springboard into discussions. Everyone was satisfied that we opened the box wide enough to permit disruptive changes, and so that participants felt safe leaning out of the window a bit more in terms of what questions they were asking in the workshop in a multi-stakeholder setting. And in the Greenbelt workshop, it was really interesting. We started off with scientific experts just pushing for modeling research, and with satellite data, and NGOs were really concerned about actors and agency on site. And the reference to the different scenarios prompted a reframing and legitimized thinking that maybe we need to combine the two and engage in citizen science approaches so that local actors are integrated in knowledge co-production. That's it. So I won't go into details how we analyzed the workshops. We always looked at whether it's polarized groupthink or issue orientation, and our workshop methods definitely in the survey afterwards showed up that they really promoted exploratory talk and minimized disputational talk and groupthink, so problem-oriented talk that permitted different opinions, but in a constructive way. And so basically, we feel that this approach to scenarios, where we have scenario scaffolds that are differentiated across different ontologies, positivist ontologies that focus on stocks and matter, socially constructivist scenarios that focus more on ideas and relations, and the last set of scenarios, the web of life scenarios, that really focus on processes and relations. So we feel our scenarios permitted a better understanding across differences and creating a safe space to voice fundamental different viewpoints in workshops of multi-actor settings. And so our 3-phase process, the most important phase was to take enough time to routing scenarios in action situations in place, and to only define boundaries of scenarios, what's in scope and what is out of scope in the different scenarios with reference to specific situations. So yes, we to some extent feel it helps to, such a process can help to overcome fragmentation of knowledge. To some extent, it can help to level the playing field between types of knowledge that may not have the same authority as a university professor or a particular expert in a particular discipline. But for sure, it is always difficult to carve out enough space and time for this level of deeper engagement in participatory multi-actor processes, and you need to pair up with organizations who have a lot of convening power. Our next steps, as Jake knows, thank you for the figure, is that we develop now transformative sustainability research as imagination infrastructures, where we really want to leave things in place that we co-create with actors across governance levels that help us stabilizing the paradigm shifts we're trying to support in terms of supporting co-creation of knowledge with citizen science and community dashboards and knowledge infrastructures that span across governance levels from local to national to EU. And the paradigm shift enrich all this with multi-species thinking and giving voice to other species using cutting-edge technologies, as Jake does with environmental DNA and ecoacoustics. That's it from me. I'm sorry I took a little bit longer than planned. This is where we stand. And
Thanks,
of course, it's a tall order, fraught with complexities and challenges and moving very slowly, but here you have the vision.
Thank you, Ariane. That's an amazing talk. Round of applause, everybody. And probably got time for a few questions if you want to put them in the chat, and we'll read them out. So we've got one question. Could you share what some of those solutions discussed or determinations came during those workshops? How were those different than other discussions?
Yep. So, for example, for example, we used the method of collaborative conceptual systems modeling, where we have different stakeholders choosing 3 or 4 factors. So if we say we want to engage in regenerative agriculture to enhance soil life and life in water, and quality of life for people and health, So what are main factors that we need to consider in support of this switch? And so different actors picked very different types of factors. So access to knowledge was one factor that was deemed important to support this switch. Consumers should have more knowledge on sustainable lifestyles, but the welfare system would need to provide space for more people to engage with time and to support community-supported agriculture to make up for the labor time for these more intensive caring practices with soil care if we don't apply pesticides for weeding or other things. So, or if we move vegetable production back to Europe, at the moment there hardly is any because it's so labor intensive and they're just not as cheap as quinoa beans. So many diverse factors were listed and put on a diagram. And so then what comes out in terms of recommendations is like, we need better regional platforms for food marketing that better link demand and changes in demand with resources required for production. And so these complex systemic conversations also basically highlighted the interdependencies between social change, technological change, and changes in farming practices. And it was diagrams like these that we produced over in a 2-day workshop that informed the scenarios that then really were detailed and used as seeds for change and practices we should promote. And then we analyzed further barriers to instituting those practices. So I think in little time, we had with stakeholders, because they're all busy in their families and jobs, we got each time extremely far in embracing the systemic complexities when we were discussing possible action fields for change and possible actions. I hope that was...
Thanks. So when you're kind of co-producing knowledge with stakeholders, how do researchers avoid reinforcing existing power structures?
Absolutely. So that's a really core question. So we had an artist on board who was extremely equity oriented and who always made fun of the powerful voices and pulled up more actors whose viewpoints might be more easily marginalized, like the lizard who lost his tail. No, but we basically had clear rules in the workshops, and we worked a lot. So if we do breakout groups around tables with different actors who have different understandings of the situation and different knowledge, the most important thing is to create a level playing field. So yes, it is nice to have unstructured, open, free, creative conversations, but usually then introverted people or people who feel they don't have as much legitimacy as others, rightly or wrongly so, don't speak up. So we always worked with paper, and everybody had time to reflect and to write post-it notes, and then we went around the table and collected the post-it notes, and then we had to develop these systemic representations of factors that mattered most to actors around the table in dialogue, referencing all the post-it notes, so that we really were sure to integrate ideas of everyone and to draw relations or even discuss differences and contradictions between them. So just leaving things open and have the people who talk is not helpful, because it's usually only a few people who talk and the others listen and withdraw if they don't agree.
Cool. Thanks. Any other questions before we wrap up? Please put them in the chat. I'll give it a few seconds.
But of course, it's difficult to have the people attend who don't have so much time. So that is really the major work. how we
Yes.
engage. Yeah, and so
Overcome time poverty.
it's a real challenge. Yeah, so it's not always easy.
Okay, any final questions? Otherwise, let's wrap up. I don't think any more questions. Thanks again, Ariane. That was incredible talk. Very informative and engaging, and such a nice way to describe your life's work, I suppose, from start to where you are now. It's a nice way of
It was
presenting your
not a
thoughts.
linear route.
Yeah.
It was a clean academic career, but I think the work is getting traction now, although maybe I haven't maximized titles or prestige in any one institutions. Being on part of advisory boards at the EU or national level definitely I feel gives the research interesting traction. So
Great.
and thank you for the funding. The last government funded this research handsomely. So that was also, yeah, without that, we wouldn't have had this traction, and having the convening power, both from the ministries and the pharma organizations, was really important. So it's all relational. Without relations, it doesn't work. Thanks. So
Nice wrap up. Thanks, Ariane. I just put it in the chat because Professor Felice Jack is speaking next Tuesday. It's our final talk of this speaker series. And she's going to be talking about the lost harvest, industrial diets, vanishing diversity, and the mental health crisis. So please sign up to that. And hopefully we'll see you then. And another round of applause for Ariane. And see you soon.
thank you,
Thanks,
Jake,
everybody.
for this opportunity. Thanks, everyone, also for the questions. I enjoyed them.
Thanks.
Bye.